Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's IANA presentation, Inside the Numbers with our friends from TTX. I'm Hal Pollard. I'm the Director of Education and Committees at IANA, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. First and foremost, thank you to our Platinum sponsors who are making this session available. They go a long way for us, and we really appreciate their help. A little bit of an agenda for today. We are going to talk about the economic conditions that we're all working within. Then take a look at the 2021 IANA numbers for the first half of the year and just kind of review those and see how they're looking and what they might indicate for the rest of the year. Then we'll dive in a little bit into international and domestic intermodal, talk about what's happening there, and then we will go to questions. So with that, I am really pleased to welcome back our friends from TTX. I'd love to welcome Awana Masri, who is the Director of Economic Planning at TTX, Peter Wolf, the Director of Market Development at TTX, and John Woodcock, the Director of Market Development at TTX. So without further ado, I will step away and let them have at it.
Thank you, Hal. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. If we can advance to the first slide. Based on the performance of the first half of the year, the U.S. economy has been forging ahead in 2021 at a rate not seen in a few decades, and it will likely sustain at an elevated pace for a little while longer. Consumers who benefited from stimulus checks and bill savings over the last 18 months, but also businesses investing to match the strong demand and the rise in employment are all contributing to growth. There are bumps in the road, and that is to be expected. Even though the recovery is strong, it follows an unprecedented event that had a profound impact on the economy and society, and things are coming back online at an uneven pace. The sharp jump in demand is causing challenges on the supply side, and that is creating the current surge in prices that we are seeing reflected in the headline inflation reports. On this graph, you have the GDP level on the gray line with the GDP components and their contribution to growth by quarter on the stacked bars. Based on the advanced estimate, the economy grew 6.5% on an annualized basis in the second quarter of this year, which is the last bar to the right. GDP is now 0.8% above the pre-pandemic level. Consumer spending carried the quarter's performance as the economy opened up, and services contributed significantly for the first time since the downturn began last year. Business investment added to growth, while net exports were a drag again. Supply bottlenecks depleted inventories, and they negatively impacted the second quarter GDP. As shortages ease gradually, inventories are expected to contribute to GDP growth going forward. This graph illustrates consumer spending and retail sales. Good spending on the blue bars supported a massive increase in retail sales on the gray line. Services represent 2/3 of total consumption, and they are critical to the economy. In spite of robust spending over the last year and a half, consumption reached pre-pandemic levels only in the second quarter of this year when the economy opened and service spending on the red bars took off and grew 12% over the prior quarter and almost 20% over last year. Retail sales data through June indicate that spending on services has not caused a decline in goods outlays yet. While March and April sales were pushed higher by the stimulus checks, May and June held at a high level in spite of weak auto sales, which were caused by supply issues. Overall, consumers still have disposable cash to spend, and consumption will continue to grow, but at a more moderate pace and with a more balanced mix between goods and services. Some of the durable goods categories are expected to see weaker growth as demand was pulled forward. Industrial production has not reached pre-COVID levels yet due to supply chain challenges, which affect materials, components, and skilled labor. For a better look at what's relevant for intermodal volume, we developed a containerized production index based on the industrial production components for the commodities likely to be shipped in containers on rail. This is the series shown on the graph on the blue line. And finished vehicles are excluded, auto parts are included. And you can see the containerized production index was mostly flat, then rose 0.1% in June over May. There are signs that conditions are starting to improve slowly. Some surveys in July indicate that price pressures may ease and employment is picking up. Durable goods orders on the red line are a leading indicator for industrial production, and they are growing, which is another positive sign for the manufacturing outlook over the next 6 months. The housing market is now at 10-year high levels, and there are many factors favorable to the outlook: low mortgage rates, flexibility created by remote working, and the demographics. However, supply constraints, both organic to the market and also caused by an overall shortage of resources, have led to price hikes, and the market has cooled off a bit. Sales seem to have taken a break, and home construction is bumpy, but the market is expected to stay around current levels as the demand is real and the need for housing is not nearly satisfied. On the next slide, the auto market continues to be affected by the semiconductor shortage. While the demand for cars is high, sales on the blue bars cannot keep up as production has been hampered by the semiconductor supply. As a result, inventories and the inventory to sales ratio are at an all-time low, and that's why prices are skyrocketing, contributing to about half of the monthly inflation increase that we are currently seeing. It is expected that the chip supply will catch up sometime at the end of this year. We may see stronger trends next year, but after that, both sales and production will likely return to the pre-pandemic trajectory. On the next slide, the labor market is recovering. Hiring picked up in July, with employers adding over 900,000 new jobs, and May and June payroll numbers were revised up. The unemployment rate is now at 5.4%. The job recovery is currently experiencing some frictions due to the ongoing mismatch between the job openings and the supply of workers, amid ongoing concerns about the virus, childcare, and some potential structural changes in the labor market. Nevertheless, the unemployment rate will likely end the year around 4.5%. And it is expected that the jobs lost during the pandemic will recover sometime later next year. Labor force participation is expected to recover more slowly and stay below where it was at the beginning of 2020 due to an aging US population, an accelerated pace of retirement, and some career reassessment plans by many displaced during last year's shutdown. I want to spend some time talking about inflation, which is making the news and has been making the news for a while now. While inflation is a sign that the economy is growing, prices surged recently to levels not seen in a while now. Some of the increase is attributed to the reversal of the price declines during the pandemic last year, but the strong demand from consumers and businesses has been leading to shortages and price hikes over the past few months. As a result, CPI, the measure of inflation, grew 5.3% in June over last year. However, it is important to look under the hood and note what components are causing the inflationary pressures. For context, the graph shows 3 different CPI series. The headline CPI is on the gray line and is the series reported in the media. The core CPI in red excludes food and gas prices, which tend to fluctuate quite a bit over time, and that grew 4.5%. The sticky price CPI in blue makes up 2/3 of CPI and includes prices that change infrequently, such as medical care, housing components, education, personal care, and it only grew 2.6%. And you see that it's more stable over time as well. The numbers on the right are peeling away some layers. They are not meant to add up, but they show the main components that are disproportionately volatile right now, even though they make up a small part of CPI. For example, used vehicles represent 3% of CPI, but contributed to almost half of the CPI increase. The large rise in energy and vehicle prices can be explained by the recent summer travel surge and the continued chip shortage impact. These are events that are temporary and are not expected to be repeated once supply challenges and the rush of reopening is out. And there are signs that some of these price pressures are leveling off. CPI for July was released yesterday. The graph is not updated for the data for timing issues, but the data shows that CPI for July was 5.3%, matching June's level. So the move was sideways rather than up as the last 3 months. There is a risk that this inflation could last for a few more months if the supply tightness persists. But at this point, the expectation is that the bottlenecks will ease by the end of 2021 and that demand will moderate at the, in 2022. So most of these price pressures are expected to disperse, but inflation is likely to stay a little higher than the pre-pandemic level for a while. And remember that inflation was way below 2% before the pandemic started. This slide shows two indexes that measure the strength of the economy two different ways. Moody's Back to Normal Index on the left measure the current status of the economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. 100 is the level before the pandemic started, and we are still below it at 92, but getting closer every week. The Conference Board Leading Indicator in Economic Index, which includes 10 macro indicators, is forward-looking, and it estimates where the economy is heading over the next 6 months. An index over 100 is pointing to economic expansion, and at its current level at 115.1 currently, it suggests growth in the outlook. Both Canada and Mexico are recovering, but lagging behind the US. Both countries had a slower vaccine rollout, but Canada's economy is poised for a strong second half of the year. Canada's GDP is expected to grow 5.9% this year and catch up with where it was before pre-pandemic. Mexico is more dependent on the recovery of the US, on imports and remittances from the US. While trade has been Mexico's star performer recently, domestic policy responsiveness and the lack of fiscal stimulus have kept Mexico's economy behind the recovery curve. Mexico's GDP is expected to grow 5% this year. This slide summarizes in numbers what we expect for the main economic indicators that I covered so far for this year. And you can read where they've been in 2019, 2020, before where we expect them to see at the end of this year. And overall, the numbers for 2021 illustrate that the economy is expected to grow above trend, and the flare-up in prices reflect that strong demand surge before the economy is expected to go back to a more normal growth. I want to close with an important development that needs to be mentioned that poses the latest risk to the outlook, and that is the Delta variant and the recent increase in the number of infections. There is not a visible impact yet in the actual data, and forecast scenarios are being developed as we speak to try to account for a slowdown because of it. The new surge could slow down the pace of employment and the service sector recovery, which is not back to where it's been before the downturn. But so far, the general path of economic growth should stay above trend. We also have to keep in mind that the virus is also impacting the fragile supply chains around the world, disrupting further shipments, materials. So in one breath, I would say, hold on, as the bumpy ride may last for a little bit longer. And with that, I have reached the end of the economic section, and I will turn it over to Peter, who will cover the next section of the presentation.
Thanks, IANA, and hello again to everyone. So this section, the latest IANA numbers section, John and I are going to present, and we're going to try a little different than what we've done in the past. And we're going to try and incorporate some of the data that IANA was just talking about and including it in with the presentation that normally just shows the ETSO database. We're going to try and combine the two. And this slide 20, is an example of that. And so when you look at the top line or top bullet where it says freight growth, That's really referring to the underlying demand of transportation of containerized shipments, regardless of mode. The baseline, what's happening with freight demand. And as Ioana was talking about, the U.S. economy seems to be doing pretty well lately. So U.S. imports are running about 18.7% higher than the first quarter of 2019. Why do we pick that period? Well, comparisons to last year, while important, really only tell part of the story. For example, compared to first half 2020, U.S. imports are actually 29.4% higher than they were a year ago. And what's happening in the U.S. is similar to in Canada and Mexico. And as Ioana just talked about, the economies of all the countries in North America are improving and getting back to their pre-COVID footing. But we wanted to give this a little bit more context and see what does this mean to the last time we had a normal year. So I don't know if you ever want to call 2018 normal or 2019 normal, but certainly it wasn't 2020. So time is, reminiscing for the good old days of 2019. But this is when the economy seemed to be growing at its normal pace and things were business as usual. So compared to 2019, the last prior period where we had positive growth for imports, U.S. imports really are 18.7% higher. Put it another way, we're seeing, in my vernacular, 18.7 kind of rounds to 20. So we're seeing 20% more imports than we've ever seen before. I'm not telling you anything new. This doesn't come as a shock, but we're all feeling, the supply chain is stressed. We're feeling that stress. Why? Well, it's 20% more imports coming in than ever before. In contrast to that, containerized production in the U.S. is still about 2% below where it was in its pre-COVID peak. So I think that's a little bit different and somewhat surprising, right? That imports are growing strong. Domestic production is a little bit weaker than we're basically flat. So what this means is the demand for the consumer goods that Ioana just talked about, that's all being met by imports. U.S. production is basically flat, and imports are just pouring into the country to meet the demand for consumer goods. So the next line, next bullet, intermodal growth, this is where we're bringing in the intermodal data, the IANA's ETSO database. And again, compared to the 2019 high, international intermodal, which is the 20, the 40, and the 40-foot container, 45-foot containers that route inland by rail, sometimes referred to as IPI for inland points intermodal or inland points intact, that's only grown 3.5%. And domestic volume, which we're combining container and trailer, that's actually 0.8% less than what it was prior peak. But keep in mind, West Coast originations of domestic traffic are up 10%. So what are the conclusions that we were reaching from all this? International production is meeting demand for domestic consumption. And instead of that demand routing in a international container routing inland, because the volume's only up 3.5%, even though imports are up 18.7, a lot more of that volume is routing in a 53-foot domestic container, or what we would call transloading. And we'll talk about more about that in a couple of other slides. And then the other piece that we want to point out, the last bullet on the bottom of the slide, is that the import and intermodal growth rate is further disconnected by the fact that we're hearing a lot of anecdotal stories that retail inventory is being built up at the coast and cargo doesn't want or doesn't need or can't get moved inland. So a lot of containers are simply becoming mobile storage right now. But we're also hearing stories from another number of retailers where they're ordering goods 2 to 3 seasons in advance of what they would normally order the goods in. Example, we're hearing stories that next summer's goods are being ordered now. And these have to be stored somewhere and they're not ready to be sold yet. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this crush of freight on the coast, but not as much freight moving inland. So if you could advance it one more slide, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Woodcock. We'll be jumping through the next several slides a little faster, just going through some of the numbers gleaned from the ETSO database. So looking at, Peter was referring in that last slide specifically to U.S. volume. So this is going to be looking at a little more broader North American summary of the IANA ETSO database for the 2021 first half. As you can see, as is obvious to everyone here, significant recovery in the volume levels across the continent relative to last year is evident. However, alluding to what Peter was referring to, when you make a comparison to prior peaks meaning the prior all-time volume level for the first half, we only see a modest increase in IPI traffic, despite surging import levels in all three countries. As Peter was mentioning, U.S. imports grew 18.7% since its prior 2019 peak. Canada's imports have increased about 6.2% since their prior peak in 2019. And in Mexico, each year sets a new record level of imports, with the exception of last year. There was, of course, during COVID, there was a decline. But since 2019, containerized imports into Mexico have increased 6.3%. And since 2015, and this is largely due to the growth of the auto industry in Mexico, imports have grown 41%, so a pretty significant amount. Domestic container has gained a little ground, as you can see, but overall, the segment's gains have come to some degree from trailer to container conversions. Despite robust volume levels driven by the brisk e-commerce and retail sales activity, trailer volume has fallen significantly since its prior 5-year peak, which occurred back in 2018. So overall, domestic volume is falling a bit shy of its prior high water mark for North America as a whole. Peter will take the next slide.
Yeah, and I would say this slide 22 is really the exact same slide I showed you in 20, except it's numbers instead of words. So the good news is you're not going to have to listen to me drone on for 5 minutes explaining the slide. You can just take a look at the numbers. I will say just on the bottom for domestic container, and then on the square on the far right, 12.1%. That doesn't quite match the 10% that I was showing on slide 20, but this is because this is simply containers, not combined with trailers. So I think the next slide is going to be John's.
Yeah, so in this slide, we thought we'd take a slightly different cut of our typical illustration of the IANA numbers and the ETSO data. I won't spend a lot of time here reviewing the information on this slide, and you can see it in the recording if you wish, or you can follow up with us with any questions you may have. We just wanted to present this as an example of how you can slice and dice the ETSO data. At TTX, we actually divide the U.S. into 3 regions for our forecasting needs. So what we do is simply combine the IANA regions. For example, U.S. East, as you see here, is the sum of IANA's Northeast and Southeast regions. So just a couple of data points that I wanted to highlight here. While IPI overall is very strong, the first half West IPI volumes still falls below the prior record level that was set back in 2014. While you can see here on the 2 lines down, the IPI East is actually at an all-time high in 2021. At the same time, if you look down to the domestic segment, the West domestic loadings are far outpacing the activity in the East. So this is interesting to us, as we believe it illustrates the impact of import port selection and transload activity that Peter had earlier mentioned, and he's going to expand on in a few minutes. So here's the first half of 2021 volume summary for both Canada and Mexico. We'll just touch on this briefly. Canada, it's interesting that Canada's volume is now in record territory in both international and domestic segments. Unfortunately, Mexico has had some challenges. In addition to COVID setbacks that IANA was referring to back in the economic section, rail has also lost some port share in Mexico, and this has been a bit of a deterioration since 2019. And this has largely been due to sporadic rail blockages by striking teachers. Most of you have probably read about the strikes that they're having. They're blocking port access, particularly to Lázaro Cárdenas. But I believe Manzanillo has been affected as well. The country's cross-border domestic volume potential is also being hampered. This has been a long-going issue. The trade imbalance with the U.S. makes the country's northbound domestic cross-border business, domestic meaning domestic container, domestic cross-border business reliant on the empty positioning of U.S. domiciled containers. Of course, current capacity constraints in the U.S. are limiting those southbound flows, and this has been a sporadic problem over the years when business is extremely strong and there's favorable pricing levels in the U.S. that will cause many of the box owners to limit the amount of empty repositioning of boxes that will go down into Mexico. This is a point of reference. About 7 to 8% of all North American originations move cross-border. When you're looking at the Canada to U.S. trade, virtually all of that cross-border volume is IPI. But conversely, when you're looking at the Mexico-U.S. trade, virtually all of that is in domestic equipment.
All right, looks like it's back to me. So showing you our forecast for North America imports, and we're looking at 17.1% growth. And you can see that the growth rate this year is more than double the growth rate in any other recent year. And even when you look at 2010, that had a pretty robust growth rate, but that was off a negative and a fairly severely negative 2009. That was the recession. So in 2010, volumes were just recovering to get to their pre-Great Recession levels. But this year, as I've mentioned before, you're looking at real growth of 17.1%, setting all-time records. And so what I'd like to illustrate with this slide are 2 points. First is the impact that tariffs had on moving production away from China, which showed up a little bit in 2019, has clearly been muted with COVID. And there really hasn't been a whole lot of change or production shifts away from China due to the tariff. But the other piece I think is interesting on the far right, where you're looking at the second quarter of 2021, you do see a dip down from the first quarter of this year. And that's precisely because of COVID and the shutdown at the Yantian port, which is a major port in China. And for most of the month of June, very little shipping occurred there because of the lockdown, because of the new outbreak of COVID. So as IANA was mentioning that COVID is still here and still disrupting the supply chain, this is a classic example of that. And we're seeing it ripple through the supply chain, where imports in June were down a little bit compared to May and July. And now they're spiking back up. And again, this reduced volume from China only because they couldn't ship from there. Let's talk about all-water share for a second. And first, let me just report on what we consider the definition of all-water share. So all-water share is the amount of volume that from East Asia, which is a region TTX kind of made up, but East Asia would be China, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and other neighboring countries. So imports that originate in that part of the world and then land on the U.S. East Coast, as opposed to the U.S. West Coast, which is typically a shorter and faster shipping time. So for 2020 and 2021, all-water share was basically unchanged. And since 2020, on average, since the year 2000, all-water share has gained about 0.8 of a share point per year. But again, for all of last year and the data through the first half of this year shows all-water share being flat. This seems to make sense. When we talk to shippers, there's a need for speed. They want to bring in their cargo to the West Coast because it's a shorter sailing time across the Pacific, and it gets to the market faster. Also, if you think about congestion issues, you can cycle time, you can move stuff faster the shorter routes. So you can actually bring in more goods to the West Coast based on cycle time duration. But it hasn't really reduced volumes to the East Coast in any way. In fact, volumes to the East Coast are much higher than they've ever been. It's just the share has stayed relatively stable for the past 18 months. Our forecast would be, I think, all-water share gains are going to resume at some point. We'll have to see how long the current crush of freight lasts before we see a meaningful shift back to the East Coast in any way. And so both John and I and IANA have alluded to this slide. This is our transload volume slide in our forecast for 2021. We define transloading as the transfer of cargo from marine containers, again, the 20s, the 40s, and the 45s, into a 53-foot container for inland distribution. So why would a shipper do this? Because it helps manage their inventory levels and increase sales. In the example that I talked about it in our May conference and other WebExes, I like to think of seasonal spring items, right? You're bringing in barbecue utensils and lawn furniture in 40-foot containers from various factories throughout Asia, land on the coast, and you'll mix up the contents of each of those containers and build a full 53-foot container to go directly to a store. You're ordering the goods 6 months in advance. You don't know where and when they're going to be needed. Maybe you're having an early spring in Chicago and a lousy spring in Nashville, or vice versa. So you don't want to have to figure out 6 months before the cargo lands on the coast where to send the goods. You want to decide where to send the goods right after they arrive in North America, and transload allows people to do that. It's become very popular. And the orangey color, that shows transload volume for this year and our forecast for the full year, and it shows more volume than ever before. And then on the other hand, you see the blue line, which is transload share, and that the share is really tanked a bit. And how is that even reconcilable? It's because so much volume is coming to the coast and so much volume is staying on the coast, going into storage there, that it's reducing the amount of goods that are overall moving inland. But that doesn't mean that transload or IPI is really weakening in any way. It just means there's more going into storage. And when we say more is going into storage, I will tell you, we don't have any data on this, right? Nobody reports it. I mean, you can get some information on maybe warehouse utilization, but for us, it's hard to get at. So it's more anecdotal what shippers are telling us, and they're telling us more is going into storage, and then we see it in the transload data, and so it seems to make sense. And I always tell people I'm happy when the anecdotal matches the statistical, and it does on this slide, even though it seems somewhat counterintuitive that transload share would be declining. And I think I have one more international intermodal slide. So North America IPI expected to grow 14.4 in total. US West 20.9, US East 12.5, Canada 9.2, Mexico 8.0, total 14.4. Again, that's our forecast for the full year. Year to date, so first half of 21 versus first half of 20, US West is growing at 28.9%, US East 21.9%, Canada 16.6%, Mexico was down 9.2%, for a total of 19.4%. So hopefully everybody could hear me. John, if the next slides, I think, belong to you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So on the domestic side, as the year progresses, we're seeing really more of the same in regard to continued freight demand on the domestic front. So domestic volume in the second quarter was essentially stable from month to month, but it did appear to slip slightly from the high end, the end of the first quarter in March. March, of course, was an aberration because of the low volumes in February, which caused some unusually high volumes in March, and then it stabilized in April. But we have seen a little bit of slippage, even though volumes are very strong. We're very interested to see July's results, as we've been kind of taking a peek at the overall container volumes that the AAR publishes on a weekly basis. And some of you may have seen that Cass released their July freight index just today, and their overall freight demand index for the U.S. showed a further 3.1% month-over-month decline, and that was after a 4.2% month-over-month drop in June. So we're wondering if the domestic figure is going to drop a little bit in July. So debate is, of course, what is influencing that slippage? Is it demand or capacity limitations? Cass's contention is that limitations in the supply chain were the primary cause, and largely we agree with that. The supply-demand imbalance is pretty obvious. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side of the slide here, this is the Morgan Stanley Truckload Freight Index, with the red line indicating changes in the supply-demand balance in the truckload market, dry van specifically, which is really the intermodal realm, intermodal world. And I usually show this slide during the graph during these presentations, and it's really an indicator of changes in the supply and demand balance, with the scale indicating that the higher you go on the scale, the tighter conditions are. And you can see that it's essentially been in record-breaking territory all year. As the year progresses, we're really expecting that from a volume standpoint, we're going to be experiencing some tougher comparisons, given that year-over-year comparisons, that is, given that domestic freight activity had roared back to life in the third quarter of 2020. As you can see on the right, we have the FTR latest FTR freight outlook for dry van. And what that is showing us is pretty indicative of what we're expecting, that volume growth in the dry van world and really related intermodal world is likely to moderate into the low to mid single digits into 2022. And while TTX's 2022 forecast is still in the formative stages, we are certainly considering the impact that we're seeing today of congestion-related pent-up demand that may translate into an extended positive freight cycle going into the first or second quarter of next year. We've heard from various stakeholders that the current congestion and service woes that we're seeing are directly the result of declining asset productivity. So we have to ask what is at the core of the productivity challenge? And we see it as being tightness in the labor market. So it's a vicious cycle in that there are warehouse worker shortages, and those are causing delays in shipping and receiving. And as a result, the trucking and container loading times and unloading times increase. And this in turn is causing trailing equipment street cycle times to soar. And when that happens, you're just eating up a lot of box and chassis capacity. And it backs itself up into congestion at rail terminals, et cetera. The labor issue, of course, seems to be an issue that transcends industries at this point. Reports of rail hiring challenges are well documented, and truckers that you see coming on record are continuing to refer to this time as being one of the most acute in terms of driver shortages. Recent BLS employment data indicates some improvement that you see in the top left. We are seeing some drivers coming back into the trucking industry, as well as you can see down below in the warehousing and storage employment index from BLS. There is some moderate growth on that sector, but it's still pretty tight. The causes behind this, they're many, they're complex, it's demographics, it's many other things. Some of the issues are debatable and contentious. One issue that we do keep track of because it's easily identifiable and quantifiable is the impact of the FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse on driver supply. And that's the chart you'll see on the right-hand side. Once the clearinghouse was put in effect at the beginning of 2020, we've seen a steady drop in driver supply as a direct result of drug and alcohol testing, positive testing that sidelines drivers and prohibits them from service. We actually expected that this was going to start tapering on a monthly basis into 2021 as the quote unquote bad actors were weeded out of service. But it's actually done the opposite. It's actually kept pace, and it's been incredibly consistent. We have a report as late as July 1st, approximately 3,000 additional drivers are being pulled from service on a net basis. Aggregate that number, and there's about 63,000 drivers that are now prohibited from service. If you consider that in the total sphere of Class 7 and 8 drivers, it's debatable how many drivers there are in the market, but if you're considering anywhere from 2 to 2.5 million, that's a 2 to 3% impact on driver supply, which in my opinion is pretty significant, especially in these days. We imagine that the clearinghouse is going to keep even more potential drivers from entering the industry, just as really a threat of being tested. And so we expect that driver tightness will remain both a challenge for the intermodal industry from a drayage standpoint and a tailwind for intermodal as a whole as we move into 2022. Okay, I'll just touch pretty quickly on the domestic container fleet. As I think I mentioned in our last call in the winter, we were really expecting very little in the way of container adds as 2021 approached, but the market has really surprised us to the upside. Based on our calculations now, the domestic container market could potentially expand nearly 10%, about 9.8% in 2021. Now, I have to highlight the word potential. Some box owners have come out and publicly commented on the challenges associated with moving containers across the Pacific. Virtually all containers, domestic containers, are actually built in China, and they have to move by vessel to North America for import. But due to ship capacity constraints, this is causing a lot of headaches for box owners and prospective box owners. So it's expected that some of the deliveries that we were originally expecting to happen in the third quarter or fourth quarter of 2021 are actually going to move off into 2022. And just a note, all the orders that we've recorded here have been on the private side. We don't have any railroad orders registered in our database. And the biggest growth segment, of course, it's on a small base, is the domestic temperature controlled segment. That's expected to grow up nearly 30%. And that's the result of a more intensive trailer to container conversions in that market segment. So just in summary, and you'll notice that we've taken a departure in this presentation. Rather than presenting domestic container and trailer separately, we've just decided to keep them combined, since there's just so much overlap now in the shippers that are using both containers and trailers as their product. They're almost interchangeable. So we've just decided to meld them together. But overall, we are seeing that we're expecting a combined trailer and container domestic market to grow about 5.5% this year, more on the container side than on the trailer side. As the first half produced growth of 11.1%, obviously our year-over-year forecast is looking a little less bullish for the second half. But that's because our full year forecast does consider current capacity challenges and really tough comps that we're going to be facing in the year's second half. And with that, I'll turn it back to Hal.
Thanks, folks. That was great. A lot of food for thought. Things are obviously happening pretty quickly, and a lot of things are changing. We've got a lot of good questions. So thank you for those insights. Let's just go right ahead and dive into some of the questions here. We've got quite a number, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. Here's one about the all-water share discussion. Do we have any insights on whether the all-water share is making use more of the Suez or the Panama Canal? And do we have any insights on discharge points, southeast versus northeast versus, kind of a mix?
Offhand, no. We used to get some data that had vessel sailings, originations, and destinations, and whether it was via the Panama or the Suez Canal. But we lost access to that data, which is too bad, and I haven't been able to replicate it. Prior to losing the data, and prior to the canal expanding, there was a lot of freight that went through the Suez Canal. Once the Panama Canal expanded, vast majority of all-water freight was going through the Panama Canal. And the Suez Canal tended to be used for routings from South Asia. And just this is where our definitions get a little squirrely, and it's more of an internal TTX thing. But if freight originates in Malaysia or the Philippines or in India, it's more likely to route through the Suez Canal to the East Coast. And there's a lot of freight that's doing that, but we don't consider that all-water freight because leaving India, the fastest way to North America is through the Suez Canal to the U.S. East Coast. So that's sort of the normal fastest route. And I think those are the vast majority of the routings now going through the Suez Canal. But again, I'm sort of answering that question blind because we used to see data and now we don't have it.
Fair enough. We've got a few more challenging ones like that, so we'll intersperse them. Here's one around value of goods shipped. Have we reached a point where the cost of goods shipped, the actual goods, is less than the cost of transportation?
Haven't heard that. I know the freight rates are pretty high if you're talking about the ocean rates, but the average container is $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 worth of stuff at wholesale prices. Retail prices are a lot higher than that. Retail value is much higher. So the ocean freight isn't nearly to those levels. I don't know if John wants to speak on the domestic side.
No, I don't. On the domestic side, I don't think you see the price increases that you've seen on the ocean side.
Thanks, guys. Here's a question about domestic container fleet size. The domestic container fleet has expanded a lot over the past several years, and a number of ports have completed major intermodal expansion projects as well. Has inland intermodal terminal capacity grown in consort with those domestic and international increases?
That's a really good question, and we've done a little research on that, and I can't say we've come to any hard conclusions. It's interesting that if you look back about 10 or 15 years, there was a massive growth spurt in domestic intermodal. So particularly on the eastern side of the eastern half of the country, you had Norfolk Southern and CSX both increasing their double stack networks dramatically, and with that came a lot of terminal expansions, which have continued, but just on a much slower basis. You have seen in the West as well some some more targeted terminal expansions. And I think the railroads are also looking at ways of operating their facilities more efficiently. And one of the ways they've done that is by reducing the number of trailers that they handle by limiting the amount of commingling, if you will, of trailers and domestic containers in the same terminal.
Got it. Here's one around peak season. And this person says, if I remember correctly, 2018 was the last year with a traditional peak season. 2019 volumes were flat throughout the year, and 2020 was a continuous increase from the pandemic low. What are the thoughts on peak volumes for this year? And will, in a sort of editorial comment, will we have to reassess what peak season actually is on the other side of this sort of strange, move towards normalcy of whatever that is?
Well, I don't think we need to redefine what peak season is, because we've just had some really bizarre years. At least on the ocean carrier side, 2019 was affected by tariffs, which pushed rate into 2018. And then last year was affected through COVID. So certainly there was a very untraditional peak the past 2 years. It's going to probably be the same way this year, where the volumes that we saw in May, June, July are probably going to be equal to what you see in August, September, and October, or close to that amount. So on the international side, it's probably pretty flat. But when we get back to normal, whenever that's going to be, whenever COVID lets us do that, I think we'll have a back to normal peak. But, the author of the question, you tell me we're going to have a normal year, I'll tell you we're going to have a normal peak. How's that? Which isn't, I'm not trying to be too much of a wise guy there, but it's really weird times, which we all know.
Yeah, and there was another question that's sort of similar around more sort of the back office stuff that you guys do, which is trying to normalize data so that we can actually look at things, whether it's year to year, month to month comparisons, or more. I mean, it really touches on a number of things, days of the week. Are there tricks that you guys employ to try to normalize data to help in the work that you do?
I assume that it has to do with forecasting and how we use the data and how we navigate through the noise. Given the completely abnormal patterns that we've seen. And there are different techniques. And this is a huge topic among economists and statisticians right now, trying to figure out how to even work through the seasonality and what seasonal factors to apply to the last 18 months. And there are techniques. A lot of the data points could be outliers. There are imputation methods, but on a general basis, before using the data and building a forecast model, all series need to be seasonally adjusted. And so we apply the same techniques to all the series to make sure that we really capture their correlation without the noise of different seasonalities. And we do adjust for moving holidays and for the moving days, the number of days, number of Fridays, and so on, days of the week for all the series. But the last 18 months pose a question and a huge issue as far as levels and patterns. And Peter touched upon how this whole past year was basically a peak season. And so right now we make assumptions based on how the economy is moving, how we see different metrics moving, and then a future will enlighten us.
That makes sense. It seems like from the numbers that we've got unprecedented inbound imports, but the numbers in terms of movements once the goods arrive on the U.S. shores doesn't seem to be moving significantly. So does that tell us that the network is at capacity?
Certainly there's a lot of volume moving through the network. It's just different than what it's been. So there's less IPI, but there's more transloading going on than ever before. So that IPI was converted to 53-foot containers. So there's still a lot moving. And then when you think to yourself, well, domestic production is really down a little bit, why would that produce more domestic freight per se? So I think the domestic freight is lining up with domestic production, and the growth in 53s is coming off of the imports. And so a good chunk of the imports are making it inland, and this part of imports that are staying on the coast, I can't tell you for certain they're stuck there and shippers are angry that they're not moving inland. But the flip side is when we talk with the BCOs, they say their freight is getting through, but it costs them more money. They have to spend a lot more effort planning, ordering it sooner, thinking about how they're going to get it inland, what time does it need to come in. And because of all that, there's more storage. So they're putting more freight on the coast and holding it till it needs to move inland. But I don't want to, tell people there isn't. I'm sure somebody out there is feeling frustrated their freight isn't getting through. I mean, there are millions of shipments. So somebody's probably upset right now, right? But I think I don't view the network is I think it's doing what it needs to do. I think it's doing pretty well given the conditions, how much freight is coming in.
It's staggering. I know we know all the numbers, but I was literally just out in Long Beach and, looking out and seeing they were on the 10th, they were working 27 ships in the San Pedro Bay, collective of ports of LA and Long Beach. And there were 30 container ships at anchor. So it looked sort of like the staging ground for Normandy invasion out there. And that's been kind of business as usual all year. So, and that's just one little, that's one piece of the larger North American puzzle for sure. Well, folks, we've got a lot more questions. I wish we could keep going, but we're going to need to wrap up. I would like to thank our colleagues from TTX for doing all the work to form this. They mentioned the ETSO database quite a bit in your talk. So just if folks are interested in that and any more information about that, they can head over to intermodal.org and we've got information there, or you can just reach out to us at info@intermodal.org and we can fill you in on how you can get access to the raw data of movements that we were talking about today. Again, another shout out to the Platinum sponsors, our year-long sponsors. These folks help us bring the education program to you. Thank them very much in this session in particular. So thank you, Platinum sponsors. Last but not least, Intermodal Expo is about a month away. We will be in Long Beach, the September 12th through the 14th. You still have time to register. And if you book now, you can still get housing within our discounted bank up through the 16th. Head on over to intermodalexpo.com if you're interested in learning more about how to register and book your time at Expo. It's going to be a great show. We're really excited. The numbers look good and people are excited to get back together. So we will hope to see you there. But with that, thank you for joining us for this IANA presentation.